Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. This shouldn't be that long of a flip, but it's a very, very important flip if you understand what I'm saying. All right, so anyway, we will come back to that point here at the very end. But just a heads up, so we're talking about the effects of global contact, right? So today in class, we spent a lot of time reviewing. We spent a lot of time going over some different odds and ends, housekeeping, make sure we know when the test is, right? So doing that. And even in one of my classes, I spent a little bit of time getting some of your study guide stuff done, which is awesome. All right, so now, but going forward, all right, we now have to talk about like the lingering effects of this giant growth of like global economics, the expansion of Europeans into this new world, and continuing to go forward. Well, one of the biggest things that we talk about in this entire flip is this thing right here, all right? So, and it's very important to understand. And for some reason, every single year, I have kids that never quite get it, all right? So, we're talking now about the Columbian Exchange. So, the Columbian Exchange is an idea. It's something that just happened. It was not intentional. It was completely unintentional. It was something that just kind of occurred. It just happened. It just did what it did. There's no other way to explain it. All that really happened is like all of a sudden, crops and animals and things that only existed in either this hemisphere or this hemisphere started getting exchanged for one another, right? Hence the Columbian Exchange. I think we should rename it to any other thing other than Columbian Exchange, the fact that it's named after Columbus, but whatever. All right, so the Columbian Exchange was when North American and South American goods like corn, turkeys, tomatoes were being exchanged for European and African and Asian goods like bananas, coffee, onions. Notice I have the words etc. written here because it's not limited to just those things. Like look at all this stuff, right? So squash, pumpkins, turkeys, peanuts, potatoes, corn, tomatoes, vanilla, beans, cacao, which is like chocolate, right? Pineapples, tobacco, peppers, all this stuff ends up going over to Europe. So when we talk about like the Irish potato famine, potatoes aren't from Ireland. The Irish were growing them after the Europeans had discovered that the Peruvians, the Incans, had them, right? And then there was like citrus fruit and grapes and bananas and sugarcane and honeybees and disease and livestock. All right, so one thing you do need to jot down with the Columbian Exchange is the North and South Americans did kind of get the short end of the stick because this stuff is okay, I guess, but like this stuff provides the basis of a lot of our diets, right? The meat end of our diet came from Europe and like the Eastern Hemisphere, and then from the Northern end, for the Western Hemisphere, a lot of our vegetable-based diets come from there, right? So now you have the ability to eat certain things that according to history, you never should have been able to have. Let's go ahead and hit up on a couple of like very famous things, right? So, had the Columbian Exchange not happened, you would have never been able to eat one of my favorite things, a burrito, all right? So, I love a burrito. Burritos are the most amazing thing that you could ever actually eat in your entire life. I'm personally a big fan of a Chipotle burrito, all right? So, and I know some of y'all are immediately going to be looking at the screen and being like, what are you doing to me, Mr. Terry? I'm so hungry now. Look at it. Oh, there it is. All right, so look at that thing. You are not supposed to be able to eat this, all right? So one of y'all are like, what do you mean? I have one like every Saturday. Like, no. Burritos shouldn't be allowed to exist because the ingredients that go into it should only be isolated to certain continents in this world, right? On this planet, you should not be able, according to the rules of evolution and science, all right, because only certain crops grow in certain places or popped up in certain places. The wheat that makes the tortilla is from the eastern half of the world, right? Europe, Asia, and Africa. Whereas the tomatoes that go in the Pico de Gallo are from North and South America, right? So before the Europeans ever discovered these two continents, these items never could have been made, right? So, for example, Europeans didn't know what chocolate was. They didn't know what potatoes were. They didn't know what corn was. They didn't even eat tomatoes for a long time because they thought they were probably poisonous, right? As you can tell, the Columbian Exchange is a very, very important thing. And here's a picture just so you can further understand it. Add South America on there too. Look at it. Look, corn, tomatoes, potatoes, vanilla, maple syrup, tobacco, cocoa beans or cacao beans, right? That makes chocolate right there. Are now going to end up in Europe because of this contact with these different areas, right? And then you got other goods coming around. You've got citrus fruit, apples, bananas. I think that's a papaya or a mango. Onions, wheat, certain types of grass, and this stuff right here, which is super, super important. And many of your parents would die if they never got a hold of. On your flip quiz tomorrow that has to do with this flip, you need to tell me what that stuff is. We'll discuss. But yeah, try and figure out what it is. All right, so anyway, that's one's going to be for extra credit, though. All right, so that one's going to be for extra credit. It's not going to count against you. Now, anyway, Europeans are going to find foods that were never available to them, like pumpkins and peppers and corns and potatoes, right? And Europeans are going to bring new animals to the Americas, like horses and chickens and goats and cows that they had never seen, right? So whenever you have the image in your mind of a Native American riding a horse, that wasn't available until that contact between the two hemispheres, right? So that's the Columbian Exchange. Now, how is the Columbian Exchange going to affect population growth, right? New foods and animals are going to establish healthier lifestyles. Even for the poor, right? Even for the poor. Like Irish were going to be given potatoes because it was considered the crop of the poor, because all you got to do to grow another potato is just one potato, right? So potatoes just clone themselves, right? That's how they grow. So even for the poor, this helped out, right? So new foods are going to become cheaper. They're going to become much easier to store. They're going to be certain foods that are not as perishable as other foods, right? So life expectancy with better diets, my wife would love to hear me talking about this, is going to increase dramatically, right? Also with the disappearance of the plague and things like that, right? So population is going to grow as more are born and less die. So looking at this population chart right here, look at this bad boy, right? You got population of the world in billions, right? So few people, a couple million years ago. And 7,000 hits, and we're making a steady little incline, and and the Black Death happens right here, and that's a nice little dip. All right, so, but then right around this region, right around the time that the Europeans discover North and South America, look at the population skyrocket. Now, of course, there are other things involved in there. Medicines, Salk's polio vaccine, penicillin, you know what I mean? But a lot of that advancement comes from the necessity to keep staying alive. Staying alive. All right, now, the other big thing that the Columbian Exchange is going to affect is not just population, but also economics, right? So a big thing happened called the price revolution, right? So underline this phrase, the price revolution. Highlight it, circle it, star it. The price revolution began when prices began to rise on certain items and fall on others, right? So this is bringing about the laws of supply and demand, all right? So the price revolution is going to create an abundance, or the Columbian Exchange is going to create an abundance of items, right? So people now had more access to certain items. They had more access to wheats and corn and tomatoes and potatoes and blah, 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 right? So that's giving you a better rounded market in a more intense global economy. The laws of supply and demand are now going to come around that are going to affect the cost of certain things, right? So let's say, for example, I have I'm like an Irish person who grows potatoes, right? And I have a ton of them, right? We'll say each of these circles equals 1,000 potatoes, right? So each of them equals 1,000 pounds of potatoes. So I right now, if I am a English lord and I own a huge area in Ireland, they grow potatoes for me, and each
today, so you picked up a stub from the subboard with an assignment for a homeowner during what time you may dispose of that paperwork.
Okay, so potato 1, 2, and if I say each of these are 1,000, that means I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? That means I have 9,000 pounds of potatoes, right? That's a huge amount. But then let's say I only have like 100,000 people I'm selling them to. Well, all things considered, I have a lot of potatoes for the people that I'm selling them to, right? So since I have so many of them, my supply is up, so my demand for that is down. And if my demand is down, that means the price is going down because there's more of them available. You're not going to pay a huge amount of money for a crop that there's a ton of it lying around. Now, let's say the opposite, though, right? Let's say that there's only 2,000 potatoes that I produce, but I still have that 100,000 people. My supply now is very low, which means the demand for it is very high, right? So making the price, again, go up, right? Now, some of my parents who are probably watching this right now are like, it's not that simple, Mr. Terry. You're right, it's not that simple, all right? But this is basic globalized economics, all right? And this is also just kind of getting across the point of supply and demand theorem. Now, we could talk all day about elastic versus inelastic demand when it comes to certain items like gasoline or milk, but I don't really think it's necessary. All right, so because I don't think you know this, but like gasoline has what's known as an inelastic demand due to the fact that it actually never changes because you're going to pay for it because you need it. So anyway, now really quick though, this is also going to affect money, right? So as we already know, the Spanish are bringing in a huge amount of money, right? They're bringing in gold and silver from the colonies. This is creating more money in Europe as the Spanish begin to pilfer it out all over Europe, right? More money is beginning to circulate. If more money begins to circulate and trade goes up, it's going to cause this. That is very important. Circle it, star it, highlight it. It's going to cause a thing called inflation, right? So inflation is when prices rise because more money is now available, right? It affects you all the time. It affects us right now. There are certain things for any of my parents that are watching this, inflation is real, and we know that, right? I remember when I was a kid, a candy bar at like a Walmart or a gas station only cost about 69 cents, right? So now they're like $1.20, all right? So like inflation is a thing. It does happen. And it started right around this time period when the economy went completely global, right? So now anyway, going into it though, then you've also got the emergence of capitalism, which is this creepy little thing that nobody had ever seen before, right? So for the longest time, remember when we were talking about the feudal system a long, long time ago, right? The feudal system, we talked about how like, here's a fief, right? The lord's up here, and the vassal is here, and the serfs are down here, and the king is here, right? And so the production of goods was all about keeping the government and everything else stable. But now something interesting has happened. Now lords, or possibly even a serf or a vassal himself, feels that they could branch off and start a company of their own, that they can start a business, that they can own privately away from the government. Because in this system, there were no real businesses. This was like, this is the era of like, whatchamacallit? This is the era of the feudal system. This was all us just trying to stay alive during the Middle Ages, right? So you could even say that capitalism, jot this down, you could even say that capitalism started with these things at the late Middle Ages when we talked about them in the Renaissance, right? Guilds, right? This idea of starting a group of craft workers to make a better item to make more money. Those guild members would be known as entrepreneurs, a business owner, right, who's going to invest money to start a company to make more profit, right? Now, remember also, during this time period when all this happened, if Columbus discovers the North and South America in 1492 and Michelangelo finished the Sistine Chapel in 1508, that means all this stuff is happening at the same time, right? Exploration, Renaissance, Reformations, all occurring at the same time, right? So that's very important to know. Now, anyway, then you've also got this thing called the commercial revolution, right? Commercial revolution is when less people it's going to like lessen the need for artisans. It's going to bring about this new system called putting out system. You don't need that. Let's skip that. All right. So anyway, now, so really, really quick, we kind of just summed it up in capitalism, right? So this is very important, though. This is huge. This directly relates to a huge concept that literally you need to know. All right, mercantilism. All right, so mercantilism is going to affect the next unit that we're talking about. Okay, so now that governments realize there's money to be made everywhere, we've got these goofy little things called tomatoes. Italians can make red sauce now. This is blowing our minds, right? So leaders, kings, governments, and countries realize that there is so much money to be made out there. With money comes dominance and power, right? So governments realize that instead of like in the Middle Ages when the lords had all the power because they controlled the people that lived on their land and the lords had to pay tribute to the king just because he was like the biggest lord out of all of them, right? They all start to realize that, wait a minute, if there's all this money floating around through the slave trade, raw materials coming from our colonies, and all this stuff moving, I can now pay for professional armies. I can pay for better governments. I can pay for all these things. So this concept of mercantilism arises, right? So mercantilism is very simple, right? Mercantilism is when you're supposed to export more than you import, right? By exporting things, that means you're selling them, and by importing them, it means you're buying them, right? So by doing that, basically in a nutshell, make a little star somewhere, what mercantilism, the goal of mercantilism, right? The goal of mercantilism is to grow as much gold, silver, and wealth for your country as possible, trying to have more than the next person. This is going to directly affect a lot of countries we're going to talk about. France is the one that actually ends up getting the most money out of it in the long run. Spain ends up getting too much of it too fast, and they kind of like hyperinflate and like freak out and almost die, right? So now countries are also going to try and discourage people from buying or selling anything outside of their country by using these things called tariffs, right? So go ahead and put a highlighter over that. A tariff is a tax on an import, right? This is going to help them make even more money, okay? So this revolution helps countries like England and France grow crazy wealthy, crazy fast, while keeping other countries who have historically been poor, keeping them where they are, right? So like, now, that is it. That is all. That is our flip for this evening. I will see you guys later. Y'all have a good one. Flip quiz tomorrow. Do not forget, study this stuff. It's going to be 10 multiple choice questions. It's going to be cake. All right? So, and I mean multiple choice questions like little simple one-word answers. It's going to be on a Google form. We're just going to not do a warm-up. We're going to do this instead. Okay? Cool. Y'all have a good one. Bye.